Hey everybody, my name's Ed. Okay, so we're going to do another trade review. This time it is going to be Give Me Liberty by Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons. This trade is a collection of first miniseries starring Frank Miller's character Martha Washington, which was first published by Dark Horse Comics in 1990. My physical copy here is from 1994. It's an action story, a sci-fi, and political satire. It's kind of overlooked now, but it's quite fascinating on a couple of different levels. So the premise is Give Me Liberty. On the face of it, it's like I said, an action-adventure story. It is set in the near future. Give Me Liberty is a dystopian future tale with social political satire. Martha Washington grows up in poverty in Cabrini Green projects of Chicago, and through a series of mishaps, Martha finds herself the target of inner city violence. She becomes a patient of a mental institution where apparently psychic experiments are going on. Martha joins the PAX or PAX military in order to start over and finds herself involved in various dirty wars sponsored by big corporations. She becomes aware of the corporation and the military and the government and finds herself on the wrong side of that conflict, which leads to a possible civil war in America breaking out. And along the way, we see several examples of the often observed and sometimes frightening future that awaits. Okay, so just to back up a little bit. So Buddhist lady just gave me this and this. Okay, so now Frank Miller, basically superstar comic book artist, grew to be a major force in the industry, both creatively and behind the scenes. Started out in the late 70s doing Daredevil, moved on to Ronin, Dark Knight Returns. His style combined like Eisner, Gil Kane, Kirby Steranko, and many others. Later, he drew in European and Asian influences, played around with visual layouts, and brought both a more mature content in terms of narrative and writing, as well as, like I said, experimented and done different things with art and layouts. Dave Gibbons is a British artist who got his start in the late 70s. Gibbons worked on titles such as 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and Doctor Who. He drew attention with American audiences through his 80s Green Lantern stint, and of course with Alan Moore on things like Watchmen and Superman, the man for the man who has everything. Okay, so I want to provide a lot of context for this one. So, all right, so just bear with me for a little bit, all right? Okay, so uh, so this comic came out when Frank Miller was pretty much on the top of his game, creatively and at the height of his popularity. So he became a superstar on Daredevil, became an experimental artist on Ronin. Ronin itself being kind of a different take on dystopian science fiction that blended samurai comics and European sci-fi. Comics, especially art of Mobius, although in a more straightforward and less humorous way. And then, of course, he becomes a superstar tour with Dark Knight Returns. During that time, the direct market grew, and so did the ages of the fans and the creative ambitions of some of the artists. So, however, as comics came under greater scrutiny for an increased level of sex and violence, Frank became an advocate for free speech and creators' rights. And while he didn't completely abandon Marvel and DC, he did begin to do more work through independent companies, most often Dark Horse. So now Give Me Liberty is a comic that combines satire and science fiction and action adventure. So we're going to go with satire as a genre or story that uses humor or irony to criticize some aspect of society or politics or art. Satire can be humorous, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. In science fiction, there's a long history of using science fiction to comment on society, just society just in general. I don't know if you would specifically call Give Me Liberty a cyberpunk type story, but it does share some elements like, the whole idea of corporate takeovers, geopolitics, computers, AI, again, the whole weird dystopia thing. But I would say in its own way, Give Me Liberty is really a satire about war, corporatism, and social trends. So it came out in the 90s. And it's set in the early 21st century, but it's really about the 80s. So, again, to dig a little bit deeper, despite Glasnost and Perestroika and the fall of Berlin Wall, uh, which had happened by the time this comic was published. The Cold War was still pretty much a thing in the minds of Americans. America was not only having tensions with the Soviet Unions, and there was a threat of World War III, but we're also involved in various smaller conflicts. We had El Salvador, Grenada, Libya, Nicaragua, Panama. The first Gulf War was happening right as this comic was being published, so it touches on Americans' questionable involvement with foreign dirty wars. And at the time, America was still trying to deal with lessons learned from the Vietnam War, as well as El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the Iran-Contra Gate scandal. The Amazon rainforest and environmentalist was in the news, and we see this as mothers involved in wars in the jungle, in the rainforest, and it is dealt with in pretty much a sarcastic parody type approach. Corporate mergers and takeovers were more and more prevalent during the 80s. The 80s was a time of corporate growth, glorification of greed, yuppies, materialism. Reagan was a strongman leader promising to bring back the good old days. The 80s was a time of great economic change. Like I said, the growth of multinational corporations, laissez-faire capitalism. This was all being championed by Reagan, Thatcher, and other conservatives. And the wars in the Gimme Liberty comic are actually wars for resources that are being fought by competing fast food chains. Another thing you got that was really big during the 80s, there was the fitness craze. Gay rights was still a thing. Designer foods. Shallow mass media. In the comic, you get one of the war machines as a giant robot built by the Big Boy Burger franchise. We have Amazon clones in here. We have, funny enough, gay Nazis. Home computers and the internet were really becoming more and more normalized in everyday life. And these were all done in the comic in an over-the-top manner and meant to invoke certain amount of humor. It's worth noting that cable news and CNN was also expanding in the 80s and the early 90s. And you can even say, well, not even, but definitely you've got the political satire of a couple of the presidents here. You get President Rexall and President Nissan. Rexall is a tough guy. Reagan stand-in. Nissan is the kind of ineffectual, bleeding heart liberal Democrat. You know, for example, maybe somebody like Jimmy Carter. I would say Frank's politics. He's described himself as a libertarian, so I assume he meant that branch of libertarianism that emphasizes personal liberty above all else. He's also a fan of Ayn Rand, and you kind of see that in sort of lone heroes that are sort of above the system. Frank has described his writing as romantic fiction, and not in the sense that he's writing about love or sexual relationships, but that he's writing larger-than-life people and grand ideas. And there's also, for what it's worth, references to Ayn Rand or Rand characters if you look for it in his Sin City stories. Let's see here, also kind of touching on that. Martha Washington pretty much fits into the idea of the hero as someone who's above the masses and solely beholden to their own achievements more than that of society. And this is definitely Frank's take on like Batman and to a lesser extent RoboCop and his Sin City heroes. Having said all that, Gimme Liberty does follow Frank's themes that he's done in other comics roughly around the same time. There's a lot of satire in Dark Knight Returns that doesn't get talked about enough. It's there in Dark Knight Returns with the news reports, the TV talk shows, the Cold War tensions, U.S. dirty wars. It's there in Electra Assassin with the Nissan caricature and the Beast who takes over this other character who's a Bobby Kennedy analog. And it's even in Daredevil Born Again with the character of Nuke being a commentary on the U.S. involvement in Latin American wars at the time. So, again, think Nicaragua and El Salvador. All right, so let's move. Okay, so getting into Give Me Liberty as a comic. As an action comic, it's expertly paced. The narrative is strong. We get a steady build to an exciting climax. Frank's dialogue is terse and clipped, but effective and actually funny in a number of places. Not so much on one-liners or anything, but ironic setups and payoffs. There's a few missteps here and there, but more often than not, it works. Frank does a good job of building Martha as a character. We see her growing up. We see she's smart girl. She's determined, forward moving. We see her as she overcomes various hardships. And while she's not super layered, she does feel like somewhat of a rounded character, physically and mentally. She comes across as humble and sensitive, yet strong willed. Frank's female heroes, I know some people think that Frank has a problem with female characters, but I think that's mostly due to Frank's Sin City material. Majority of the female characters there are mostly femme fatales and or literal prostitutes, but people forget about his earlier female characters. For example, Casey from Ronin and Elektra from Daredevil were assertive and competent and are meant to be sympathetic and or badass characters. Martha follows in that tradition and proves that if he wants to, Frank is more than capable of writing strong female protagonists. One of the characters that grows to be the main antagonist is Moretti. He's one of Martha's military superiors. He's a fun villain, but he's pretty one-dimensional. He's basically evil for the sake of being evil. We don't learn much about his backstory or motivations. The only reason he seems to be doing whatever is because of some personal quest for power. There's Raggedy Ann, who's a girl with psychic powers. She's sort of reminiscent of the psychic kids from Akira, where they're really young, but they're also prematurely aging. I think Akira came out in 1988, but I'm not so sure. It's a direct influence, but we're not too sure where she comes from or what her backstory is. She's kind of more there to support Martha and help Martha triumph over adversity. There's a couple other minor characters that are pretty interesting, or I'll say fun. There's an Apache leader who's part of a Native American resistance movement. And then there's like the Surgeon General, who's pretty much a cartoon villain, but he's still pretty fun. Now, Dave Gibbons, of course, did Watchmen, so some of that influence may have worked its way into Gimme Liberty in terms of using representations of media as part of the world building. Frank keeps the tone a lot lighter, where Watchmen is quite dour and depressing. Frank does a more comedic direction. Another comic is interesting to compare to is American Flag, which was another sci-fi satire that includes much media and advertising parody as part of its ongoing storytelling. There's also a sci-fi camp a yarn called Star Trek by Lane Lee and Michael Kaluta that uses similar methods to tell its stories, also influenced by things like RoboCop, which Frank incidentally, or maybe not so incidentally, wrote a sequel to that also was released in 1990. Like I said before, I do like the incorporation of media to comics, so we see bits from parodies of Time, Newsweek, Playboy, the TV news, advertising. Frank used TV and news reports to great effect in Dark Knight Returns. And David Gibbons is a really good traditional comic book artist, as far as layouts and things like that. He does establishing shots, clear storytelling, good at doing action, and doing compositions within the panels. The sense of place is clear, so even when we jump from scene to scene or between comics page to story, different media, it works well. Rarely is it confusing. He's put together lessons he's learned from Watchmen to good use here without necessarily repeating that approach. He doesn't use the strict nine panel per page grid that he used there. Here, use a more varied approach. It's not flashy, but it is good, solid composition, and it mixes the layouts for what works from panel to panel and scene to scene. All right, so just to give you some random examples of the art. Where was that? Here's some of the basic layouts. Ooh, can you see that? All right. There's some stuff with young Martha. Here's some media. Meat rack. You're receiving Raggedy Ann for the first time. Okay. More fake media stuff. Is kind of more like in the Time magazine, Newsweek. Martha in the Rainforest. Dispatches home. Badass Martha. And we, I don't want to give too much away. There's some more crazy action. Yep. And we also got throughout these kind of nice little painted covers and painted media. See if I can find another one that doesn't give too much away. Oh, here. Oh no, I better. That's kind of plot stuff. I was going to show you a pretty interesting map they had going on. Oh, but here's another good. Here's another good painted cover. But here's more of the media and the talking heads. More fun stuff. You're never too young to join. Okay. All right. Okay. So moving along then. So, in conclusion, Frank Miller does a good, interesting, thrilling, and often funny tale of writing, and David Gibbons does solid visuals and great storytelling to give us a striking and humorous story about politics and social corruption in the future. We see the dangers of increasingly dumbed-down media, the problems of unchecked military. The near future world is dominated by corporations, and America is on the brink of civil war. But Frank shows us a strong-willed hero who is able to rise above the corruption. It's not a stridently left-wing or right-wing comic. Give Me Liberty story is full of humor and critiques of the American politics of both the left and the right. But again, it's Martha Washington, the individual, who triumphs rather than any specific ideology. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And you guys all have a great day. Bye-bye.